So we got this up. All right. So hello here. We're live here. We got this here. What are we talking about today? We're talking about SIBO. Okay. Small intestinal bacterial overgrowth. Man, this is a big one. This one's popped up probably more the past few years. Well, I guess in my, time practicing, it's definitely popped up a bit and it's definitely become, I think, more people are aware of what SIBO is, right? So if we start at the definition, I have a definition here from the Journal of Gastroenterology and Hepatology. We have SIBO is defined as excessive bacteria in the small intestine. It remains poorly understood. Initially thought to occur only in patients in small numbers, but it is now apparent that this disorder is more prevalent than previously thought. Well, that we're going to get into. We'll get into some of the numbers later, but what we need to know is kind of what are some of the symptoms. Now, if you're good, I'm going to read some of these off here, and I'm curious to see if anything really kind of defining, pops out for you. So we have things like nausea, fatigue, bloating, rashes, sometimes vomiting, diarrhea, could be acne, skin problems, eczema, asthma, depression, malnutrition. It could be unexplained weight loss or weight loss in general, could be joint pain, could be rosacea. So there's a lot of different, you know, things that could be going on. Other signs that could be, associated with it are some sort of malnutrition. So maybe you're not absorbing certain nutrients, right? Iron deficiency anemia, the most common anemia we have, could be due to SIBO, believe it or not. B12 deficiency is a big one, and both of those are actually going to be involved with something we're talking about, especially with stomach health. We'll get to that. Fatty stools, that can be a sign, and also things like non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. So those can be big ones too, along with things like heartburn or abdominal pain, constipation, or even just like general IBS type symptoms. Sometimes it's really tough to distinguish, what is SIBO versus IBS. That is pretty, tough to distinguish. Right now, we kind of know, roughly 10% ish, or it's thought at least 10% of all IBS patients actually have SIBO. Now, you can test for this. There is a glucose or lactulose hydrogenase test that you do. It's a breath test. You may have seen it or you may have done it sometimes. It's taking breaths, usually into a balloon, and you cap it and you send it to in the mail to a lab, and you'll get a result. Do you have a certain type of SIBO? So is it, a methane based one? Is it a hydrogen based one? Those are some, lab tests that you might be able to see, with SIBO. So in terms of like some of the symptoms, in terms of, how it's diagnosed, those are some kind of things that we know. What we also know, though, is that it tends to be generally underdiagnosed, again, because it kind of falls under the IBS, irritable bowel syndrome, right? Syndrome, when you hear syndrome, you always have to know, oh, hey, like this is just, it's kind of like we don't know. That is really where, SIBO or sometimes SIBO could just be under an IBS diagnosis, and that could be, an issue. We do know that SIBO can be there. There are other conditions that may be present with SIBO. So, for example, if there is a celiac disease diagnosis, you're 50 to 66% more likely to have a SIBO diagnosis. If there's liver cirrhosis, liver damage, 50% more likely. If there's lactose malabsorption, 90% more likely. If you're obese, there's a 17% more likelihood. If there's diabetes, more likely to have SIBO. If there's motility disorders, i.e., diarrhea, constipation, more likely to have SIBO. If there's pancreatitis, more likely to have SIBO. So yes, everybody and their mom is getting IBS. SIBO is kind of like, it can be misdiagnosed as that. So if there is something that's irritable bowel syndrome, it is possible that it could be undiagnosed SIBO. So important to kind of keep that in mind, something to kind of keep in mind as you're going along. And like we talked about, with SIBO, you can get things like anemia, poor absorption of fats, B12 deficiency. It could be an issue with bone density. So, usually, this is going to come back to the stomach. We're going to talk about that. But the stomach, you need stomach acid to absorb minerals properly, including calcium. If there's damage to the intestinal lining, that's going to be an issue. So, again, just a quick quote again from that same journal article. SIBO develops when the normal homeostatic mechanisms that control enteric bacterial populations are disrupted. The two processes that most commonly predispose to bacterial overgrowth are diminished, and these are gastric acid secretion, which is stomach acid, and small intestinal dysmotility. So the two things that are disrupted, that are most likely to cause SIBO, based on what we know right now, is low stomach acid and a small bowel that is not moving properly. In other words, you're not funneling food fast enough. The peristalsis, the muscular contractions of the intestines are slow, and and when this happens, bacteria can ultimately set up shop essentially in the small intestine, usually in the latter half of it, but that's where this happens. So keep that in mind is if SIBO is going on, you're the thinking something's going on with the stomach acid, i.e., there's not enough, it's not acidic enough to break down these bacteria, or the small intestine is not moving as well as it should. If the small intestine's not moving at the rate it should, you might need some sort of prokinetic, something like ginger maybe, to get it moving. Or more importantly, you might need more fiber to actually build up the strength of that to get those peristaltic movements, those movements to move the food along faster so that they can't set up shop. So again, multi-pronged approach here. Now, stomach acid, this is big. I mean, if you've been hanging around me long enough, this is usually one of the first things that I like to check because I find in many, many people, this is inhibited in some way. Now, we do know that as we tend to age, we produce less stomach acid kind of as we age. But we need stomach acid for a variety of different things. One is it helps break down protein. This is primarily where protein digestion starts. It's in the stomach. The more acidic the stomach is, ideally you're looking for a range or a pH range of 1.5 to 2.5. Um, it's going to help break that down, but it also helps clear out a lot of different bacteria and other ingested microbes. They can get killed off in the stomach so that they don't end up further down the digestive tract. Now, if your stomach acid is not acidic enough, then it could lead again to SIBO because it's not killing off the amount of bacteria it should or the types it should. And certain ones are essentially surviving the digestion process longer or more likely to survive it than they would otherwise. The other thing that stomach acid is really, really useful for, it's for mineral absorption. And I think a lot of people like either miss out on this or don't connect the dots. So like certain minerals really important to have enough stomach acid because you need them for absorption, right? So B12 is usually a big one. Um, Iron is going to be a big one. Zinc and calcium. Really, really important. If your stomach acid is not acidic enough, you're not going to be able to absorb these nutrients as efficiently as you should. The other thing, and this is important too. So one thing that the pancreas and bile, the gallbladder, do is they'll release enzymes and they'll release bile into the small intestine when that acidic, broken down food enters the small intestine. Now, to get it right, there's a lot of different chemoreceptors there. So, and part of what bile does is it raises the pH. It makes the rest of that food more alkaline once it exits the stomach and enters the intestine. So the more acidic it is, the more bile is going to get released. But if the stomach isn't acidic enough, you're not going to release enough bile. And this is where you could potentially lead to fat malabsorption, when we were talking about earlier. because if the pH is going to be the trigger as to how much do I secrete, if it's already not very acidic, you're not going to release enough of those lipases and bile to break down the fat, and then you get fatty stools, and that's how it kind of comes back to the stomach. So when at least I'm looking at digestive issues, I like looking at it from essentially literally the top down in terms of chronologically the things it hits. Because if the stomach's not doing its job initially, that you need that to happen in order to develop something like SIBO. So you have to kind of look from the top down and affect it usually in that order. That is usually my thought process. Now, obviously, muscle testing and some other things can come into play in terms of like what things might you might want to address first, or if there is maybe some underlying infection like SIBO you want to clear out first, and then you start doing that. But it's important to kind of keep that in mind because getting the stomach acid corrected is going to have positive downstream effects on digestive enzymes, on bile release. So all of that stuff's going to play a role. Really important. We're also got to talk about H. pylori a little bit here. So H. pylori, interestingly, so we all sometimes you might hear about stomach ulcers, issues like that, and like, oh, it might be a H. pylori infection. Well, that's kind of like interesting because roughly like 1 in 2 adults actually have H. pylori at any given time, but not everyone has H. pylori symptoms. So, and it's thought that roughly around 70% of people are asymptomatic. And interestingly, the gastric cancer happens in less than 3% of these people. So in other words, if you have H. pylori, you're probably 90%, 97% likely to not get something like gastric cancer. So is it protective? All I'm saying is it's worth asking these questions because when you're talking about microbiome and certain things that we need, you have to remember, is it necessarily an infection or is it an imbalance? Because a lot of these things, you have to remember, we're symbiotes at the end of the day. We survive in conjunction with a lot of these things. Now, let's talk about some medications when it comes to SIBO. And you're going to hear a lot of things that I talk about with the stomach. PPIs. We know when you take PPIs for long term, that could potentially lead to bacterial overgrowth both in the stomach and in the small intestine. Why? Because you're diminishing the amount of stomach acid you can make, and it creates an environment where more of potentially opportunistic bacteria can survive into the gut. So this is a big problem. Um, so PPIs do this. H2 blockers do this. H2 blockers are another type of medications that are do this. Uh, so these proton pump inhibitors, these H2 blockers, antacids, all of these use different mechanisms to slow down or essentially stop the production of stomach acid. In other words, it makes the environment in the stomach less acidic or a higher pH. Now, sometimes, if you say, oh, well, you have, GERD or you have, reflux, they'll give you one of these medications. And short term, you actually might get some relief. But the problem is, if you are constantly altering the pH of the stomach, it is going to negatively affect it downstream. And it's going to lead to some real issues. One of which can be poor gut motility, which we talked about. And another one that we talked about is SIBO, because again, you're diminishing the amount of stomach acid you have in the stomach. And you're creating an environment where bacteria or fungi or yeast can set up shop. So, SIFO is another thing. We're not going to be talking too much about that today, but small intestinal fungal overgrowth, creating an environment where the migrating motor complex, which is how essentially it acts like a sweep. Your small intestine has a mechanism that every hour and a half to 2 hours, it pushes everything down through the intestinal tract into the large intestine. And if that's not doing its job on a regular basis, these are where these things can kind of boil over and become an issue. So we got medications that can become an issue. So we got Stress is another thing that can become a huge issue here. So, when you're constantly stressed, if you're eating in a stress state, this is why it's so important. We talk about deep breathing when it comes to eating. Looking at your food, enjoying it. Food is I think the only form of art on the planet where you can actually engage all five of your senses, right? Because most art, you're not eating, you're not smelling. You might hear it, you might see it, but you're not eating it, you're not sensing it in those ways. It's really a form of art. So take that time, take those deep breaths before you're eating to just be present with your food and be grateful for it, because part of that is it's going to stimulate stomach acid production. I need to take a sip here. And when you're in a state of chronic stress, what's that going to do? It's going to slow down metabolism. It's going to shift blood away from the gut, including the stomach, to the muscles, to the brain. Um, and what's that going to do? It's going to decrease nutrient absorption. It's going to decrease oxygenation to the blood. It's going to increase cholesterol. And it's going to inhibit or potentially lead to a negative impact on your gut microbiome. Because again, you're slowing down that migrating motor complex. You're not releasing enough stomach acid to make the stomach acidic enough to break down everything it needs to. Now you're setting yourself up for a position to potentially have something like SIBO. So you have to kind of keep in mind that that's really important. And the question is then, like, how do we, get out of this? What is the way, forward here? So like you have to understand, again, I talk about the microbiome all the time. The GI, that your gut flora, your microbiome, it's really important. It we have a symbiotic relationship with them. And it's really important to understand that, because it's very much like a forest, right? And it's influenced by what's put in it. So if we're taking out some of the things that it needs to survive, like fiber or enough stomach acid to break certain things down, then certain things are going to be able to dominate and flourish in other conditions. And we need these bacteria because we need them to create nutrients for us, like short chain fatty acids, which actually heal the gut lining. It also helps us create vitamins like folate or like vitamin K, which is really important. So, vitamin K is kind of important. We talk about it with bone health and clotting factors. There are intestinal bacteria that actually make that. So, it's really, really important on that way. But it can also be influenced by a lot of negative factors, like some of the drugs we talked about, like by caffeine, by alcohol, by environmental factors, different medications. If you're consuming food sprayed with glyphosate, these essentially have antibacterial effects in the gut, which again create an opportunity for opportunistic bacteria. So hopefully all of this is starting to, make sense. So when you put together processed foods and antibiotics and antacids and PPIs and proton pump inhibitors, you're creating a situation, an environment, you're essentially, what you're doing is you're putting the rainforest, you're setting fire to it. And what comes back into play, it's kind of up for grabs. And these opportunistic species that might not have had an opportunity otherwise kind of come into play. So, where do we go from here? So, we got to talk a little bit about antibiotics, and then we're going to talk a little bit about the immune system, and we'll go right into kind of like what makes sense here. So, antibiotics. Now, I think it's even most people in the conventional community now know that antibiotics are overprescribed. Many times, if you get the common cold, you might get a script for antibiotics, which makes no sense because most common colds are viral and antibiotics do not do anything for viruses, which is very strange. It's estimated that over a 154 million antibiotic prescriptions are written in doctor's office and emergency departments. And it's estimated, again, according to the CDC, 30% of them are unnecessary. That's according to their numbers by the CDC. 30% are unnecessary. And again, most of these for acute respiratory conditions, usually viral things that antibiotics would not do anything for. Other things you might want to worry about with antibiotics is conventional animal foods. So, confined animal feeding operations. You may have heard of this. This is called CAFOs. These are a huge problem. One, because they're god awful for the environment. And if you ever want to talk about real things that can affect climate change, it largely goes back to, and this is kind of a sidebar, but after going to Plant Based Expo last week, they take the one step, but they don't talk about a lot of the GMO crops and antibiotics like glyphosate that we'll get into in a minute that can cause a real issue not only to us but the actual soil, the actual biome. Like that, there is, I think, real connections between our own microbiomes and the biomes of the soil. And you're noticing that as our soil begins to deteriorate, so does our health as a general public. That's not by accident. But back to CAFOs here. So if you're getting or if you're consuming conventional animal products, those animals are given antibiotics partially as a prophylactic, but the other part is to actually help them grow faster, believe it or not. They're also given um, added hormones, so exogenous hormones, again, to help them grow faster. And you have to remember every time you consume those, you are consuming partially those products. So you are consuming some of those antibiotic residues, some of those exogenous hormone residues in those foods. And you wonder why we have a lot of different hormone issues, gut issues. It's because those things do actually survive the tract. We know things like glyphosate. If a cow, for example, has corn that was sprayed with glyphosate, that stuff survives the cow's digestive tract. It makes it all the way into the cow. Then from there, it ends up, if you eat the steak, you're going to end up consuming a little bit of it that way. So it is kind of important, like, to understand the whole part of it here and kind of how it works. Now let's take a step back. Let's talk about Th1 and Th2 community immune responses here. So we tend to live mostly in a Th2 environment. Now let's break these down first. Th1 is really responsible for it's your initial response to new things you see in the environment. So if you come across something new in the environment, if you come across a new pathogen, that's where the Th1 kind of comes in. Th2 is actually what stimulates, it's the antibody response, essentially. So if you see this with injections, that's essentially stimulating the Th2 response. You're passing over the humoral, that type of the Th1 immunity here, which is really important. So the more you lean in Th2 dominance, we have issues with certain other things. So in other words, you're not actually getting the full response that you should. That's an issue, first of all, with injections. The other part, again, leading this back to antibiotics and why this is an issue. So if you're exposing yourself to antibiotics either through conventional animal foods or through GMO crops or things sprayed with things like glyphosate, these are going to be huge issues because they act, or glyphosate specifically acts like an antibiotic. Now, again, I talked about this before, I think in a post yesterday, but like the proponents, the backers of glyphosate will say that glyphosate's not an issue for humans because it affects the shikimate pathway. And if you look at mammalian cellular metabolism, human cells, mammalian cells don't have a shikimate pathway, which is true. But what does are all the different microbes that live inside of us. So if you're having something that is sprayed with glyphosate, and keep in mind, this is only one herbicide. This has nothing to do with all the other ones used. This is just the one we know about. It can kill different microorganisms in our gut. And we also know that the residue levels that are permitted in food are somewhere between 40 and 800 times the antibiotic threshold and concentration shown in clinical studies to damage mammalian tissue. So even the studies that they've done the amounts that are used in real life are much, much higher. Important to kind of keep that in mind. Food for thought. So, and so it's really important to keep that in mind in terms of like all of these things that can affect SIBO in terms of like what you can do and how you can kind of, clear it up a little bit. So the question is now, with all that done, what are we going to do about it? Well, the goal, again, is to help repair some of the intestinal tract, get rid of any bacterial, fungal, microbial overgrowth, and then bring in a diet that is a food plan that is very nutrient rich, lower, a higher nutrient to calorie ratio. Really, really important. So, where do we start? The first thing that starts, and we're going to talk a little bit about like the 4 R's. You'll hear this talked about in functional medicine a lot. So, a lot of people who practice functional medicine, including me, I was taught this, and there are different ways you can kind of take this depending on who you work with. But if we're talking about clearing this out, a couple things we got to do. First thing is we got to get rid of as much of the stuff that makes it worse as possible. Processed foods, GMOs, processed grains, artificial sweeteners, artificial sugars, dairy, conventional meats, vegetable oils. All of those things have to go. If you're going to keep putting poison into the system, it's not going to get better long term. This is the hardest part, is getting this stuff out. The tricky part with SIBO is that there may be sensitivities to certain food, but remember the goal should be to be as tolerant to foods as possible, to as wide variety of foods as possible. So that's the ultimate goal in terms of where we want to work towards. So again, we need to get those things out. That is usually part one of this. The next thing is, if there are foods that cause issues to start, like sometimes it could be certain high fiber foods, we can take them out short term, but it's important to keep it short term, like no longer than a month and a half, because if you keep it out long term, you're going to start developing food sensitivities to that, and then you have to reintroduce them, and it becomes more confusing and harder. But we need to kind of keep that in mind. So with that, we got to remove all that. We also got to remove things. So if there are food sensitivities, if there are allergies, if we can get off alcohol for a little bit, if there are things like non-steroidal anti-inflammatories, those are things that we're going to have to try to work ourselves off of if we want to fix this. Now, to start, then we need to try to use some antimicrobials that can be helpful. Now, everyone's different with this, and obviously, this is not medical advice, but things that I've used in the past are things like berberine from things like golden seal, black walnut, barberry, oregano is really good. There's a ton of different ones, and everyone is going to react different, but these are really useful. Now, with this, it's important, again, to talk about things like opening drainage pathways, supporting the liver, making sure you're going to the bathroom at least once a day, because you may get some die-off reactions. These are called like Herx reactions. And this doesn't necessarily mean you're getting worse, but the thing is, as you're killing off these pathogenic bacteria, they can release toxins and you can feel worse for a short amount of time. You can use things as binders in that case, like chlorella or cilantro or something like that. Again, this is why it's really important to work with a provider who has done this in the past, including, like I said, I'm more than happy to help with this. Those things are really, really helpful. Once we get to that point, as soon as after we've kind of cleared that out, then the goal is going to be replace things like get stomach acid going again. Can we reintroduce maybe something like apple cider vinegar or digestive bitters, like gentian root or orange peel, licorice, all these things that can really help stimulate that stomach acid production and get all that stuff to work properly again. Again, we could use things that are going to move the bowel. The bowel is a little bit more efficiently, like we talked about before. Prokinetics can be helpful, like ginger. Um, Chinese basil is a good one. So there are plenty of things that can be really helpful there. We want to get in more prebiotic foods, again, slowly increasing the variety of different plant foods. That might take a while if you're sensitive, but those are going to be really helpful because those prebiotics are going to help build up the good bacteria pool that create the short chain fatty acids that end up healing the gut. We can also then use things to help heal the gut, like um, slippery elm or marshmallow root, really good. Zinc carnosine's really good. L-glutamine's really good. What else is there? Licorice is really good. Peppermint, aloe. Like there's so many different things that we can use to help repair it. And you got to be like really patient with this stuff. It does take some time. Sometimes there's trial and error. Some studies actually show that actually up to 2/3 of those with SIBO can have a relapse. So you have to be really patient with this stuff. This isn't stuff that like you fix overnight. It does take some time. It does take some effort. Um, but it will, start to get better the more that you kind of work with it, are patient with yourself, and get back into it. So, other things, like I said, we talked about digestive enzymes. Maybe you might need zinc or iron. Those can be really helpful too, especially if you might be, deficient in them because there is an overgrowth and you're not absorbing those at the rate you should. B12 too, because again, those are the most common deficiencies we see. Make sure we're getting outside as much as possible. Vitamin K, really important. Those are going to be your green leafy vegetables, scallions, cruciferous vegetables, cucumbers, basil. Like all of these things are great sources of vitamin K. Once we can start introducing probiotic foods after we deal with the underlying infection, probiotics really good too. Those are all really good options too. And then yeah, we kind of go from there. So, like I said, there's a lot to do. That's kind of like a general overview. But everyone, is a little different. Everyone kind of needs their own, unique protocol in a way. Everyone's a little different in terms of what they can do and the timeline they're doing it on. So, this is why it's really important to, work with someone on this. This is just more kind of like the general overview of what it looks like. I hope this was helpful. I'd be more than happy. Like I said, I am still taking new patients. So if you'd like, I'd be more than happy to, work with you one on one. Like I mentioned before earlier today, just started also offering iridology as part of iris analysis, as part of my intakes with new clients and patients. So if that's something you're interested in, that can help kind of be another piece to the puzzle that we can add, to these concepts here. So I hope this was helpful. I hope this, really kind of made some sense. Again, this stuff is not easy. There's a lot of different factors that go into it. It definitely takes some time to do. Um, so you got to be patient with it, and you got to really kind of stick this stuff out and try. But I'm more than happy to help. If we can, feel free to shoot me a DM over here on Instagram, and yeah, we'll be in touch. Much love. Have a good one. See you next week.